Live from Seoul, South Korea. Hey, Bret, how you doing?
Hey, Greg, thanks. Good Tuesday morning from Seoul, South Korea, where President Trump will begin the second leg of his Asia tour just shortly. North Korea obviously dominates the talks here. Big economic moves are also big, but Texas is not far from the president's mind. This is Special Report. Good evening, I'm Bret Baier, coming to you tonight from Seoul, South Korea. We are covering the president's trip here, and we have two big stories for you tonight from here and back at home, where investigators are piecing together what led a man to kill more than 24 people in a small Texas church. This as we begin to put the faces of the lives cut short, including small children in that church. President Trump weighed in on the shooting from Japan before leaving to land here in Seoul just a few hours after spending time with Prime Minister Abe in Japan. He talked about the allies discussing a host of issues, North Korea topping that list. I spoke exclusively with the Prime Minister of Japan, and we will air that here in just a few moments. But beginning here in Seoul, we start with Chief White House correspondent John Roberts.
President Trump called the Sutherland Springs massacre an act of evil, but blamed it on a man he called deranged and not on the weapon he carried.
I think that mental health is your problem here. This isn't a guns situation. I mean, we could go into it, but it's a little bit soon to go into it.
Too soon for the president, but not for many Democrats.
I reject the notion that it is too soon to act. If not now, then when? We should ban assault weapons and bump stocks today.
There are common sense measures, Connecticut has implemented them, that have actually reduced gun violence. These laws work.
In past shootings like Orlando, President Trump has remarked how the death toll might have been lower if another gun was pointed the other way at the shooter. Precisely what happened in Texas on Sunday.
Fortunately, somebody else had a gun that was shooting in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it would have been as bad as it was. It would have been much worse.
The shooting weighed heavily on the president's state visit to Japan and talks that dealt primarily with the existential threat posed by North Korea.
Strategic patience is over.
While President Trump has been roundly criticized for his strident language toward Kim Jong-un, the newly re-elected Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe emerged from the meetings to say there is no daylight between them.
Japan consistently supports the position of President Trump when he says that all options are on the table. Through the talks over 2 days, I have once again strongly reaffirmed that Japan and U.S. are 100% together.
Some people said that my rhetoric is very strong, but look what's happened with very weak rhetoric over the last 25 years.
Twice in recent months, North Korea has test-fired nuclear-capable missiles over Japan's northern island of Hokkaido. At a press conference, Abe was asked why Japan didn't attempt to shoot them down. That's when President Trump jumped in with a Buy American pitch.
He will shoot them out of the sky when he completes the purchase of lots of additional military equipment from the United States.
The proof, President Trump said? Saudi Arabia's weekend shoot-down of a Houthi missile aimed at Riyadh Airport. A U.S.-built THAAD anti-missile system blew it out of the sky. But in the middle of all the tough talk, an olive branch of sorts to North Korea. After meeting with relatives of Japanese citizens abducted by the North, President Trump appeared to call an audible, suggesting Kim Jong-un could buy himself some goodwill and a possible opening.
If he would send them back, that would be the start of something I think would be just something very special.
North Korea will be top of the agenda when President Trump meets later on today with South Korean President Moon Jae-in. In a tweet early this morning, President Trump called Moon, quote, a fine gentleman, and said, we will figure it all out. But, Brett, they have to figure out more than just North Korea, because President Trump is not at all happy about the state of the trading relationship between the United States and South Korea. Brett.
John Roberts here in Seoul. John, thank you. My interview with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in just a minute. But first, some of the other headlines making news today. Names like Queen Elizabeth, Bono, President Trump's own Commerce Secretary, among the names mentioned in more than 13 million pages of financial papers that show how the rich and famous invest their money and hide their assets. Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen has a full report on the Paradise Papers coming up. Saudi Arabia's newly established anti-corruption committee overseeing the arrest of top princes and officials said today that evidence of widespread corruption has been uncovered and trials will be held soon in the first acknowledgement of the seniority of those under investigation. Skeptics believe the sweep is to round up potential rivals of Saudi's crown prince, who heads the committee. Connor Powell with that in a bit. The markup began today, meantime, in Washington in earnest on the Republicans' tax reform legislation. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee warned of a monumental challenge as they work to amend the bill that would slash corporate rates and add $1.5 trillion to the nation's debt. They hope to send it to the full House by week's end. Leaders hope to pass through the House by Thanksgiving. Now to that interview we mentioned. Before arriving here in Seoul, South Korea, I sat down with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in between his meetings with President Trump. I started by asking about the two leaders' rapport with one another.
The Japan and U.S. alliance is the cornerstone for peace and stability here in the Asia-Pacific region. And naturally, the leaders have to be able to have a relationship of trust and confidence as well as mutual understanding. That would have to be decisively important for the strengthening of the alliance. And for that to have purpose in the last year after President Trump has won the election, I went to New York in November to meet with him, and I was able to have good communication with him. And ever since then, for 6 times I have met with him, and this time as well, I have enjoyed playing golf as well as having had dinner with him. It was indeed a very enjoyable occasion, and for myself and President Trump to share, the time to build a relationship of trust will further deepen mutual understanding. And before President Trump visited Japan, Mrs. Ivanka Trump, advisor to the president, visited Japan, and she has attended the World Assembly for Women. And she has given a wonderful speech. She stated that Abenomics is womenomics, and that has impressed many people in Japan. With President Trump's visit to Japan this time, I very much hope that we will be able to further solidify the U.S.-Japan alliance. And I hope that I will be able to take time to fully discuss with President Trump on various international challenges, including North Korea.
The main issue, obviously, that hangs over this trip is North Korea. North Korean missiles have flown over your nation 2 times in recent months, leaving your citizens rattled, leaving the world wondering what is next here. Is there anything short of military action that you think can be done to force North Korea to denuclearize?
North Korea back in 1991, Kim Il-sung himself, who is the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, had committed himself for denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, and at the time of the 1994 Framework Agreement had once again promised not to develop nuclear weapons. And in 2005, when the 6-party talks agreement was put forth, once again, North Korea promised to abandon or dismantle the nuclear program. And every time of those occasions, Japan and the United States promised to provide support to the North Korea. But North Korea has used those talks just to gain time to further develop the nuclear program, as well as missiles. So North Korean dialogue just for the purpose of dialogue is meaningless. That is our experience. Now is the time to further put pressure on North Korea. And in that sense, the sanctions that were agreed in the United Nations resolutions, which were put forth in September of our international community, must firmly implement those sanctions. We have decided to cut back 30% of oil as well as other petroleum products exported to North Korea. And as winter comes on, this will be quite effective on North Korea. Since the United Nations Security Council resolution had been adopted unanimously, including with the support of China as well as Russia, so all countries that need to firmly implement the resolution will be extremely important.
You and your party just recently won a landslide victory here, and part of that was on a platform of national security. Do you envision changing your pacifist constitution, Article 9, to enable Japan to have more offensive capabilities?
The Liberal Democratic Party, ever since the founding of the party, has always put forward as the party policy the amendment of the Constitution that is to not have offensive capabilities for Japan. That is not the reason why we are putting forth such a policy now. In the election campaign this time, we have also put the amendment of the Constitution as the main issue, and we have actually delineated 4 items of the amendment of the Constitution in our campaign, and we won the election consequently. What we have promised in the campaign is to amend the Article 9 of the Constitution to clearly mention the presence of the self-defense force in the Constitution, and that is what we have put forward to the Japanese people. And the purpose of that was to put an end to the debate which contends that the self-defense force is now in violation of our Constitution. In any case, in order to actually amend the Constitution, we need to have a 2/3 vote in both the upper as well as the lower houses. And then on top of that, we need to go through the national referendum ultimately. But first and foremost, what we need to do is to deepen our debate within the national diet.
Right, so there's logistics to get that done. Short of that happening, should the U.S., do you believe, try to shoot down the next missile that flies over Japan? And do you believe that the U.S. has the capability to do that?
We are witnessing very solid bonds between Japan and U.S. based upon our alliance and in accordance with the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. The United States has a duty to defend Japan if and when Japan is under attack. And under this very strong U.S.-Japan alliance, whenever an attack is made on Japan, Japan and the United States will work closely together to respond to those threats, and we have been confirming this. It is a fact that North Korea is going ahead with developing the missiles, but Japan and the U.S. should join our forces and work closely so that we will be able to protect the peace and security for Japan, as well as for the whole region. And our missile defense technology has already attained a very high level.
Are you worried about Kim Jong-un?
What would be the stance and the attitude that Kim Jong-un may take going forward? It is exactly what not just myself, but the whole world is watching keenly. North Korea does have very diligent people and is bestowed with rich natural resources. So as long as they're able to take the right policy, I'm sure the North Korean people will be able to enjoy a better life. What we are doing now is the international community has applied pressure to North Korea so that North Korea will have to change its policy. And we would like to create a situation whereby North Korea itself would come to us and say that they will change their policy and that they would like to engage in a dialogue.
Last thing, where do you see the future of U.S., Japan on the economy? And what tangible things came out of this visit for both countries?
The bilateral economic relations between Japan and the U.S. should be something that both of our countries benefit from this economic relationship. Now Japanese companies that invest in the United States have created 860,000 jobs directly. For example, if you would take the automotive industry and take in consideration the dealership selling the Japanese cars, including related jobs as well, overall, those Japanese companies have been creating 1.5 million jobs in the United States. The outstanding foreign development by the Japanese companies in the United States is next only to the United Kingdom, about $421.1 billion. And those American workers working for Japanese companies enjoy a very high level of income on average. Their wage level is set to be $81,000. And even this year, after the Trump administration had started, an additional 17,000 jobs have been created by the Japanese companies. And this is the #1 amongst all the foreign countries. The Asia-Pacific region is set to be the growth center of the world. What is important is to create a free and fair economic arena in the region. Of course, it is very important to have that dialogue and trade between our two countries, but what would be very important would be within this region for Japan and the U.S. together to build free and fair economic and investment rules. And what would result in bringing in significant benefits to the United States as well as Japan, and would also be conducive to the sustained growth in this region. In that sense, the inclusive dialogue of what I have just mentioned between our Deputy Prime Minister and your Vice President Pence, the economic dialogue will see concrete results.
Sounds like more golf rounds ahead. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much.
For more on the president's trip to Asia and his relationship with our allies in the region, let's turn to senior political analyst Brit Hume. Good evening, Brit. Your thoughts on the importance of this trip for the president?
I think it's a very important trip. I think easily the most important that the president has taken so far. The president seems to behave differently on a world stage than he does back home. The kind of disputes that he gets into, the Twitter wars and so on, seem to be set aside in favor of his desire to build these better relationships abroad. He seems to have certainly done that with Prime Minister Abe, with some assistance, it should be noted, from their golf games that they've had together, which have met with so much snark back here in the United States. And even, with the Chinese leader, how well that will go obviously remains to be seen, and we'll know more about that later in this trip. It does seem, Brett, that the trade issues that may unite and or divide the countries on this trip have been set aside and priority to, at least to some extent, and priority given to security issues, principally North Korea. And Prime Minister Abe's remarks about that and his seeming solidarity with U.S. policy at the moment was certainly interesting to hear.
Yeah, for all of the troubles, as you mentioned, that President Trump has at home, obviously the Russia investigation continues, low approval ratings, he gets a lot of grief in all kinds of media coverage. You just don't see it over here. You see a lot of a different level of respect, not only for the presidency, but President Trump in the way that he operates differently than any president has ever done before.
That's true, Brett. It's also probably worth noting here that in the case, for example, of Prime Minister Abe, you heard him mention in his discussion with you the security pact that we have with Japan. So when you look at the world from the point of view of Tokyo, looking at the United States with threats in the region potentially growing and others potentially arising to follow them, naturally, he would like to be able to look at the United States and say, well, I have a strong friend and partner there, just for purposes of fulfilling that agreement. And you heard what he said about missile defense. He certainly seems like he would like it very much if a missile were on the way to Japan, for the United States to shoot it down, or perhaps for Japan itself to do so. So out of these needs may arise stronger relationships that might otherwise exist. And I think the president, when he's outside the United States, I think he feels he has at home at least some strong political instincts which may guide his behavior. But he gets treated with respect around the world. He likes that. He's has insecurities. He doesn't have them bruised by what goes on. And he behaves, as I mentioned earlier, he behaves differently. I think he's serious. I think he realizes he doesn't know everything there is to know about the world, and his behavior is different, markedly so, I think.
Yeah, Brett, as always, thank you.
Thank you, Brett.
When we return to Seoul, South Korea, a small Texas community in mourning here in the town that has taken this amazing and horrific event over the weekend. 26 people killed. That story when we come back. Welcome back to Seoul, South Korea. Back in the States, much of the nation's attention is on Texas. 26 people who were just spending their Sunday morning, like many of you across the country do, shot dead while worshiping in church. Among those killed, 8 members of one family, including a pregnant mother of 5. 3 generations of family members' lives horrifically taken by a 26-year-old man with a history of violence. Vice President Mike Pence will visit Texas on Wednesday, but tonight, correspondent Matt Finn reports on some of the heroes rising from this horrific act.
2 Good Samaritans are credited with springing into action and forcing the Texas church shooter Devin Patrick Kelly to flee the property Sunday, potentially saving lives. Authorities say an unidentified neighbor heard the gunshots, grabbed a rifle, and engaged with Kelly. That unidentified neighbor chased Kelly and then flagged down Johnny Langendorf. The 2 men chased the shooter as he fled in his SUV.
I was at an intersection and I saw the firefight between the shooter of the church and a neighbor, a resident here in town. After the firefight, the shooter took off, and the neighbor came over, jumped in my truck, and said he just shot at the church, and said we have to get him. I said let's go, and that's what we did.
Authorities say Kelly led a troubled life. He was discharged for bad conduct from the U.S. Air Force for beating his wife and stepchild. Kelly's troubles all came to a head before he took his own life. Authorities say he sent threatening text messages to his mother-in-law, who went to the church.
We know during that pursuit, the suspect used his cell phone to notify his father that he had been shot and didn't think he was going to make it. Subsequently, he shot himself. We know that he expressed anger towards his mother-in-law, who attends this church.
Many questions remain about why Kelly killed so many innocent people, but the swift action of two brave Texas men likely ended his rampage before he could kill more.
I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. I hope that the families and everyone affected this community, I hope they're able to sleep a little better at night knowing that this man is dead and won't hurt anyone else. It does not bring complete justice, but it does bring a conclusion.
Tonight, 15 victims, including 5 minors, are still being treated in local hospitals, some in critical condition. And we've also just learned that the U.S. Air Force did not submit the criminal records of the church shooter to the FBI as required by the Pentagon, potentially making it much easier for the church shooter to purchase a gun in 2016 and 2017. Bret?
Matt Finn in Texas. Matt, thank you. Up next, lifestyles of the rich and famous. Some of the big names caught up in the so-called Paradise Papers that even reportedly show investment ties between Russia and a member of the president's cabinet. First, though, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 41 in Louisville, where Kentucky Senator Rand Paul is recovering from 5 broken ribs after he was assaulted at his home. A senior advisor says it's unclear when Paul will return to work due to pain from those injuries. Police arrested Paul's neighbor, Rene Boucher, for the assault. His lawyer said today the dispute was not over politics, but one that many people would regard as trivial, although he did not elaborate. Fox 28 in Columbus, Ohio, where children's advocates say the state's opioid crisis is stretching the state's foster care system as more and more children are removed from their homes of drug-addicted parents. They're asking voters in 5 Ohio counties to vote Tuesday to help address funding shortages. And this is a live look at New York from our affiliate Fox 5 there. The big story there tonight, Anthony Weiner is behind bars. The former Democratic congressman surrendered to officers this afternoon to begin serving his sentence for inappropriate texts with an underage girl. Weiner will serve a 21-month sentence at a facility outside Boston. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway. For a special report, we're way outside the Beltway, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Seoul, South Korea, as we continue to cover the president's trip to the region. New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez says he's feeling confident following closing arguments in his corruption trial. The Democratic senator said outside the court this evening that he thinks the government floundered its closing statements. He looks forward to a not guilty verdict in the case. The jury got the case this afternoon after his attorney spent nearly 3 hours on that closing statement. Prosecutors last week characterized Menendez as a personal senator to his wealthy friend. A worldwide investigation by a group of journalists offers a glimpse at how the rich and famous invest their money and hide their assets. Among the bold-faced names, Queen Elizabeth, Bono, and President Trump's Commerce Secretary, who's shown to have some indirect investment ties to Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Tonight, Chief Washington correspondent James Rosen leads us through the labyrinth known as the Paradise Papers.
A year ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin waited in his Novo-Ogayovo residence outside Moscow to see Leonid Mikhelsin, CEO of Novatek, Russia's largest independent natural gas producer. Last month, Putin applauded a new concert hall in St. Petersburg with businessman Gennady Timchenko, a target of U.S. sanctions. Those men and Putin's son-in-law, Kirill Shamalov, are the owners or major shareholders in Cybor, a Moscow-based energy firm that has done some $70 million in business with Navigator Holdings, a Marshall Marshall Islands shipping firm whose stakeholders include Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. The disclosures appear in 13 million pages of leaked documents from offshore financial firms, published in newspapers worldwide as the Paradise Papers. The papers reportedly show Queen Elizabeth invested some £10 million offshore, with some of the royal funds steered to a now bankrupt lender. Likewise, U2 frontman Bono.
I didn't make my name in mathematics.
Reportedly invested in a Maltese holding company that purchased a mall in Lithuania, now under investigation for possible tax evasion. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which researched the papers, acknowledges all of these arrangements are legal.
There's also the question of whether America's top economic representative in dealings with foreign countries should have a financial stake in a company that's making money from Putin cronies.
In the case of Secretary Ross, whose cabinet agency helps implement sanctions, ICIJ claims his stake in Navigator, while disclosed in 3 separate places during his confirmation process, was not sufficiently advertised.
Cybor itself was not then sanctioned, is not now sanctioned, and never was sanctioned in between.
There ought to be hearings, and if he fails to provide a convincing and compelling explanation, he ought to resign.
Except that a spokesman for the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, John Thune, agrees Ross disclosed his Navigator stake and has simply asked Ross to follow the advice of his department's ethics officers if they determine there's any conflict. Brett?
James Rosen live in D.C. James, thank you. Voters in Virginia head to the polls Tuesday to vote for their next governor. And a new Fox News poll out tonight shows Democrat Ralph Northam with a narrow lead, a 5-point lead over Republican Ed Gillespie. Correspondent Peter Ducey reports on whether Democrats can hold the state if Republicans can possibly pull off another upset there.
The Old Dominion may be looking for a new direction.
This is the most important governor's election in our lifetime.
Republican Ed Gillespie could pull off an upset in the Virginia governor's race tomorrow in a Commonwealth that went for Clinton last year. Gillespie never campaigned with President Trump, while the Democratic candidate Ralph Northam had help here from former President Obama.
Or if they can't hold Virginia in this kind of environment, maybe you provide sort of a roadmap for Republican candidates in those states to sort of not run away from Trump necessarily, but keep Trump at arm's length.
Gillespie, a former RNC chairman, seems to have united the establishment and so-called Bannon wing of the party. And Steve Bannon said this weekend he thinks Trump voters will send the Republican candidate to Richmond. Today, Gillespie said if he wins, he'll partner with the president who endorsed him.
Any governor of Virginia has to be able to work with the President of the United States.
The Democrat Northam has been doing his best to make President Trump a liability for Gillespie.
We watched a campaign in 2016, one that was embarrassing for this country, but it was also a campaign that was based on a lot of hatred and bigotry and discrimination and fear.
But likely voters say the most important issues to them are the economy and health care. Still, a group backing Northam, the Latino Victory Fund, tried to bring racial tensions front and center, producing an ad showing a truck with a Gillespie bumper sticker speeding menacingly towards minority children.
Dangerous illegal immigrants back on the street.
But since Gillespie ran ads calling Northam weak on gangs like MS-13, the DNC chairman sees the violent truck ad as fair.
When you hit the bully back and the bully starts crying, those are crocodile tears to me.
Ultimately, the big challenge for Gillespie is going to be convincing Republicans to vote Republican.
Are basically suburban Republican-leaning voters in Northern Virginia willing to vote for Gillespie when they weren't willing to vote for Trump last time?
President Trump is pitching in, tweeting this afternoon. He thinks the economy here in Virginia has been terrible under Democratic rule. But Gillespie must overcome history to win here tomorrow because voters in Virginia have elected a governor from the party opposite, whoever the sitting president is, in 9 of the last 10 elections. Brett?
Yep. Peter Ducey, live in Virginia. Peter, thank you. Stay right here on Fox News Channel. We will be following all the results of the election, the Virginia gubernatorial race, the race we just told you about in Peter Ducey's piece, as well as the New Jersey governor's race right here on Fox News Channel. The markets today A record high on Wall Street for all three major indices. The Dow closed up 9. The S&P 500 rose 3. The Nasdaq jumped 22. Next, a big shakeup in Saudi Arabia as the Crown Prince oversees the arrest of dozens, including one of the world's richest men. President Trump is expressing his confidence tonight in Saudi Arabia's heir to the throne as he continues a roundup of rivals. The president tweeting a short time ago, quote, "I have great confidence in King Salman and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. They know exactly what they're doing. Some of those they are harshly treating have been milking their country for years," he continues. Correspondent Connor Powell is following all the developments tonight.
Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, tightened his grip on the kingdom this weekend, arresting dozens of senior Saudi royals and officials. The 32-year-old heir told the Arab channel NBC the purge was needed to stomp out corruption.
Every person who has engaged in corruption, regardless of their status, will be held accountable.
Among the dozens of princes, military officers, and top officials arrested was Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, one of the world's richest men. Talal is a major player on Wall Street and an investor in Citibank, Apple, and the parent company of Fox News, 21st Century Fox. The arrest of so many senior Saudi officials has raised suspicions. The purge was not just about tackling corruption, but also removing potential adversaries as well.
He's gone after people who can both undercut him politically and have the financial resources to create alternative power centers. I think he's also sending a message that no one is beyond his reach.
Bin Salman has tried to craft a reputation as a reformer, and the Trump administration counts him as a valuable ally. But to date, he is most known for managing Saudi Arabia's disastrous war in Yemen and intensifying the regional conflict with Iran, which this weekend escalated even further after a missile landed near Riyadh's airport. Saudi officials say it was fired by Yemen's Iranian-linked Houthi rebels.
We see this as an act of war. Iran cannot lob missiles at Saudi cities and towns and expect us not to take steps vis-a-vis Iran.
Saudi officials described this weekend's arrest as, quote, phase 1 of their crackdown and promised to deliver evidence against those detained sometime in the future. Brett?
Connor Powell in our Middle East newsroom. Connor, thank you. Next up, the All-Star panel weighs in on how the president's trip to Asia is going so far. First, beyond our borders tonight. Ousted Catalan President Carles Puigdemont is already out of jail and already criticizing Spain. Puigdemont tweeted today that the country strays far from democratic practices. The former leader of the Catalan region of Spain is in Belgium fighting extradition to Spain along with 4 other allies. Diplomats and activists are gathering in Germany this week for 2 weeks of talks on the Paris Accord to combat climate change. The talks are the first major global climate conference since President Trump announced the U.S. will pull out of the accord unless he can secure a better deal. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis is in Finland this week to meet with NATO allies to discuss the next steps in Iraq and Syria as ISIS loses ground there. Mattis says the key to keeping the terror group from rising again is getting the peace process on track. Mattis also said the U.S. is still working to resolve conflicts with Russia in the increasingly crowded skies over Iraq and Syria border, where a lot of the fighting has shifted. Those are just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back with the panel here to Seoul, South Korea.